Hello everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Today's story, Mystery of Harold Magee. Hello there! We found a page in our scrapbook the other evening that told the story of Ross Gear, the cool and courageous watchman at the Aberdeen logging camp, who outsmarted a forest fire and saved his own life and that of his wife, once long ago. We had other stories of the fiery threat to our forest that had destroyed so much of our fine timber, and written blazing chapters of human bravery, tragedy, and loss. But one story that we recalled when we told you the story of Ross Gear the other evening was the story of Harold Magee, a tragic story which stirred Grays Harbor for weeks back in the early months of 1931, and that produced a mystery that was eventually solved. A forest fire played an important part in that yarn that we reenact here on Grays Harbor nearly 20 years ago. And we're going to find that story tonight in our Hometown Scrapbook. So when George Edgar has given his usual spiel from our sponsor that brings you tonight's program, we'll open our scrapbook to page 323 and the story of Harold Magee. Harold Magee was a Cosmopolis boy. He was 23 years old in the spring of 1931 when he worked on his brother's ranch up at the Wishkah Valley, and he was the kind of lad who enjoyed the outdoors in which he lived. Between his chores on the Wishkah Ranch, he found time to hunt and fish, and he knew the hills and valleys of the Wishkah and the Wynoochee like a book. Now, if you remember the spring of 1931, you'll recall that it was a very good spring, from the standpoint of weather, that is. True, business was at a low ebb. Communists were holding street meetings in Aberdeen and Hoquiam, exhorting the forgotten men to march on the city hall, and communist candidate was running for mayor of Aberdeen. Sawmills and logging camps were down, and were learning the meaning of the new era. We called it the Depression. But the weather was fine for a depression, and the unemployment used the bright days to go clam digging at the beach and fishing in the streams, and for Harold Magee working on his brother Arthur's ranch up at the Wishkah, there wasn't a care in the world. Harold had things just about caught up that Tuesday morning in April when he went over to Gabe Sears' place to get him to go fishing. They had been planning to wet the line in the Wynoochee River for some time. Gabe knew the hole over there where the trout fought for the white water spinners, and they'd set Tuesday morning as the right time. But when Harold got to Sears' place, he found Gabe nursing a sprained ankle, and no amount of good fishing could make him hike over the hump between the two valleys with an injured foot. So, about 10 o'clock in the morning on the 21st of April, Harold Magee started out alone. He had his rifle and his fishing pole and a pocket full of gear and a hat band full of books. He put an apple in his pocket and strolled up the trail that ran to the hump separating the Wishkah and the Wynoochee. Arthur watched him move along the trail, his head and shoulders visible above the sea of dry fern. Then Harold Magee disappeared over the rise in the ground, and one of the most perplexing mysteries in the history of Grays Harbor began. For Harold Magee didn't return that night, nor the next night, nor the next week, nor ever. No, not one got very excited about it the first day, because they had other things to think about. Some campers in the vicinity of Donovan Corky Camp had left a campfire get away from them and started a fire in the slash near the camp. The camp wasn't working, but a few of the men who lived there turned out to fight the fire, and a lot of the ranchers pitched in to corral the blaze that was threatening to sweep over the hills and into the homes of some of them. But when Harold didn't show up on the 22nd, his brother Arthur was worried, and on the morning of the 23rd he went down to the Wishkah schoolhouse and talked with Principal B.S. Duskin about his problem. The principal was quick to help. He proposed that they organize some search parties right away and notified the sheriff. While Arthur called Montesano, Duskin got his high school boys together and divided them into teams. One would be headed by himself, and M.T. McCoy, a teacher in the school, was to lead the other group. On the noon of the 23rd of April, the first search parties began to comb the woods in the little hump that divided the Wishkah and Wenatchee valleys up near the headwaters of the rivers. The fire was still burning as the searchers set out, and the first move was to head for the blackened lands near the logging camp to see if Harold had been trapped by the flames and burned to death. And through the afternoon they hunted, but the slight trail that they had followed over the hill disappeared into nothing, and none was able to turn up a clue of Harold Magee. That night, the newspaper spread the story over the front page. The mystery of the missing lad gave the depressed harbor something to get excited about, and the next morning a detail from the sheriff's office joined in the hunt, along with volunteers from Aberdeen and Cosmopolis. But the second day's hunt was no more fruitful than the first, and as the weekend approached, the searchers appealed for help. Any volunteer searchers were asked to meet at Salmon Service Station on the Wishkah Road early Sunday morning. More than 100 showed up to help, and as teams moved across the logged-off lands in the upper Wishkah, it seemed certain that they would be able to cover every square inch of the high ground between the valleys before night. The shouts and signals of the searchers echoed back and forth amongst the hills, and the burned overland, still warm from the slashing fire, was combed for a possible sign of a body. But when night came to the Wishkah Valley, the searchers came trudging in to report there was nothing, no sign, no trail, no evidence to show that Harold Magee had ever been in the hilly country at any time. For several days after the big Sunday hunt, groups of Wishkah residents continued the search. Then they gradually, as farmers went back to their own affairs, the published reports began to drop off. It was a mystery. Folks told each other, probably no one would ever know what happened to Harold Magee. Then shortly before the next weekend, a couple of loggers coming out reported that they had seen a man answering Magee's description wandering aimlessly in the logged-off lands. Interest flared anew. Perhaps Magee had been injured and was lost. Searching where the loggers had seen the wandering man, the parties turned up the trail of the Wishkah farm, who had been hunting for a stray calf. But as the second weekend approached after Harold Magee's disappearance, he stirred the harbor. Volunteers were again called for. Mayor George Griffiths of Aberdeen asked for volunteers again to meet at Sampson's service station, and this time it was now the 3rd of May, and a throng responded. And again the hills were combed, and again the results were same. No sign of Magee, no trail, no clue, no body. The valley residents posted a $100 reward for anyone who could provide information on Harold Magee. Jack Ekstrand urged sportsmen of Grays Harbor to aid in the search. Principal Richard Balkema of the Weatherwax High School announced that the boys of the school had volunteered to aid, but none of the organized searchers produced a thing. The fire had blotted out traces of the trail which left Harold Magee. Hounds used to pick up the scent stopped at the edge of the big burn, and then followed a series of wild rumors, a sort of thing that so often follows a tragedy or an event of great human interest. Magee was reported to have staggered into a logging camp up at the Wenatchee, half starved and weak. He was reported to have been seen in Montesano. The rumors were varied, but none led to anything. Harold Magee had walked over the hill into the Wenatchee and right off the face of the earth, as far as people of Grays Harbor were concerned at least. Now the summer of 1931 started with a wet June. The dry spring had built up a full tank of rainwater for old Jupiter Pulvis, and he cut loose on June and July. By August, Grays Harbor had all but forgotten the tragedy of the lost boy of the Wishkah, and that autumn, as deer season opened, the hunters flocked into the uplands to get their venison. The name of Harold Magee had been virtually forgotten. They parked their cars on the Wishkah side of the hump and started into the hills. The big burner around Donovan Corky Camp number 6 looked like a good open spot to hunt. They followed deer tracks into the blackened area, weaving their trails in and out of the second growth that fringed the burn spots. It was Stratton that spotted something on top of the big fire-blackened stump at the edge of the burn. It was no deer, but it was certainly not something that belonged there. He called to his hunting partners, and together they worked their way through the clump of sallow to the high stump where unmistakably the leg of a man showed over the edge of the old cut. When Thompson crawled up the steep side, he knew at a glance what he had found. It was the body of a man wearing scorched clothing. A rifle lay nearby, and a body had been shot through the head. Touching nothing, the two hunters hurried to the logging camp to report their find and escort some of the camp crew back to the stump to show the way. That afternoon, the sheriff and the county coroner, E.L. Calhoun, made the trip up the valley to bring the body out. It was, as some had already surmised, the body of Harold Magee. But that didn't tell the tragic story of his end. It took some reconstruction, some studious assumptions to do that. But between the sheriff and the coroner and friends of Magee, the story of his last hours was pieced together. Well, we'll tell you the story in just a few seconds, but let's pause right here and have a few words from our sponsor. Yes, the sheriff and the coroner and the friends of Magee pieced his tragic story together. The searchers had been over the spot where the body was found many times during the hunt for the missing lad, but none had looked high on the old fir stump that rose above the ground a dozen feet. From the scorched condition of his clothing and the path he had apparently taken, they decided that Magee had been hemmed in by the flames from the fire that had started the day he went fishing. He tried to make his way around them and finally been forced to take shelter on the stump. As the fire closed in, he tried to hide from the searing heat, but there was no retreat from the stump. When the heat became unbearable, the lad had calmly put the muzzle of the rifle against his head and pulled the trigger. The mystery was solved. The last lines of the story of Harold Magee have been written, the story that Grays Harbor lived through and talked about for 2 decades, and which we find tonight as a somber story in our hometown scrapbook. Thanks for listening.